Early church historians record Peter's death at the order of the Roman Emperor Nero during the 6th decade of the 1st century of the Common Era. For more than 30 years, Peter had followed the Word made flesh. His faithfulness landed him in prison, with an execution date looming. During his life as a Jesus follower, Peter learned the high stakes of his calling. He warmed his hands by that soldier's fire on the night of Jesus' arrest, after all. But it's a different thing, a heart-pounding, world-swirling thing, when the hostile walls descend upon you, too. If we exercise for a moment our homiletical imaginations, perhaps we can see Peter, older, grayer, wiser, willing to die for his faith, in solitary confinement, reviewing his life, thinking back to what had brought him onto Jesus' path. Peter surely thought back to his first encounter with Christ that day on the Galilean seashore, when his boat was put to use by this stranger, one who had already performed the wonders of healing his mother-in-law, one who had been drawing crowds and was now speaking right beside him. It was his voice, Peter might have said. I could hear in his voice the echoes of the Spirit that called the world into being. I could feel in his voice the power that calms chaos. I trust that voice when it says, "Peace be upon you." And when the voice called me by name, I knew that Jesus held every prayer I had ever prayed, every hurt carried in my heart, held out to me a life I could scarcely imagine I might live. Have you heard that voice? Because this is how God's call begins, speaking to us along the shorelines of our lives, speaking to us across the chaos, assuring us that his peace still exists, his power for life cannot be defeated, inviting us to step into the courageous compassion that is the life he brings. Maybe you were walking the dog, catching the sun's first rays as they brighten the sky, wishing this day might be one where you felt like you made a difference. Or maybe you were in yet another endless meeting, wondering where you could be that you knew existed deep within you. And a voice said, "I call you my child. I call you into life." Or perhaps the voice came as you waited in line at the grocery store, exhausted from the day but not really quite finished, assuring you that grace is available for every need, for each labor of love still ahead of you. Jesus was teaching around Capernaum, a small harbor fishing town, and so many flocked to hear him because his voice is truth and love and the promise of God real. And you and I have that sacred task of living into God's love, truth, promise, realness. Jesus was addressing the crowd, but suddenly he is speaking directly to Peter. Put out into the deep water. Peter's fished all night. He's come up empty. He's cleaned his nets. He's gone back out to sea as a favor to this teacher. And what does Jesus say when he is done teaching? Not let's go home, not let's get some breakfast. Instead, Jesus says, dig deeper. It's not just his voice recalled Peter. It is this insistence to go deep. Now, Jesus' use of the word deep could reference chaos, the fathomless sea where monsters roam and evil reigns. Go out there, Jesus says, because that is where life is most threatened, where my good news is most needed. Or the image of casting one's net into the deep might mean going into the unknown, the unseeable, the risky places God's path can take us. Go out there, Peter, says Jesus, to people that you don't know, to do things you've never done before, to act with courage you didn't know you had. Discipleship is about following Jesus into places we would not go otherwise. But I hear, put out into the deep. And I think, go into the depths. Go into the depths of human experience. Go all the way down into the heart of things. Don't be afraid to really meet people and to find yourself known. Go deep. We live much of our life on the surface, after all. We rush from one place to another. We binge watch TV shows. We scroll our phones. We settle for quick contacts or quick judgments instead of the time-consuming, heart-requiring work of being fully alive. Have you heard the invitation to go deep? Have you experienced a moment when you had nothing in your net, no energy to try again, and yet Jesus pushed you forward out into the deep? The first call I experienced was a call to be closer to Jesus, to learn something of the Word, God's speech and Spirit alive in my midst. It happened at the end of an ordinary worship service on a regular Sunday morning, when I, as an elementary kid, was an acolyte and got to watch up close the distribution of communion, could feel in my heart the nourishment of Jesus' love. The second call I felt was into set-apart ministry, which emerged a few years later as a young adolescent. It was scary at first because I didn't know many female ministers. I couldn't quite imagine myself in the pastor's life. At the same time, I had that sense in my gut that this is what I was supposed to do, even if all the details weren't quite clear. The third sense of call I had came when I neared seminary graduation, unsure of my next step. I agreed to an overseas placement, landing in the pain-filled, hope-filled, post-apartheid South Africa. I remember getting on the plane from New York City, nonstop to Johannesburg, which was a 19-hour flight, and thinking, what am I doing? And yet it was there that I met Jesus in ways I had never experienced him before, in the faces of orphan children, and the courage to rebuild a country, and the way pain and love co-mingled into new life. A fourth sense of call happened when the district superintendent called and said, the bishop and the cabinet are going to appoint you to Grace Church, a church I had never seen. It was an unexpected call, a surprise shift in my placement and my family's home. And yet in the afternoon after that surprise call, sitting in the sanctuary of the church I was currently serving, I sensed a call. This is what you're supposed to do, even if all the details are not clear yet. A fifth call, a little different than these others, happened several years ago when the Reconciling Committee welcomed T.C. Morrow, a person who was at the time a candidate for ordination in our conference, but whose path had been halted because of her sexual orientation. T.C. spoke that afternoon at a gathering of the Reconciling Committee and others, and when she started, I found that tears formed in my eyes. And the thoughts that ran through my head were, I'm done. I'm done with restrictions and justifications that tell anyone they are barred from the fullness of acceptance, the fullness of life. Now, this wasn't a new position for me. Grace was a reconciling church. I had walked with other candidates in similar situations. But it was a moment of clarity, a moment of renewed purpose. I came to see a call to act with deeper intentionality, with greater determination and advocacy. And like a net overflowing with fish, sharing in that work of opening doors with others brought an abundance of blessings. It was like stepping into a river of grace I didn't know was walking and flowing right beside me. It was the joy of more deeply interconnected mutual life. The call of Christ is hard, yes, but the call is so much more. It is holy and joyous. It is grace upon grace. And there's not just one single call on our lives. God doesn't call us once and then sit back and stop speaking. God calls again and again and guides and moves. God encourages and clarifies and makes a path, a way out of no way. For a season, Peter's call was simply to follow Jesus, to learn from his teachings and healings, and to witness to the Word made flesh. But then in another season, the mantle fell upon Peter to preach and to baptize, to lead a brand new church, to risk the gospel moving into new spaces into the world. And with each turn, Peter was in conversation with the Christ who had called him, just as Peter and Jesus spoke to one another that day on the boat. Put into the deep water. Are you sure I've tried already? Do not be afraid. I will give you what you need. At his life's end, Peter might well have said, that day I heard Jesus' voice. Jesus became real to me, became for me the truth and love and grace and power that I had to follow. For only this is life. How is God calling us right now? It is not an exaggeration to say that life is on the line today, that lives are threatened by the loss of aid to vulnerable communities, that lives are harmed by language calling others, some others, or less than, or not worthy of welcome, that so much is being dismantled right in front of us. I have two thoughts. One, I think that God is calling us to be truthful, to be committed to the truth in all its complexity, to name what is happening, to say what you're feeling and seeing and what is keeping you up at night. Surface living will not hold us right now. We are being pushed into the deep. And the good news is that the realness of God can hold the truth of our times, can answer the truth of these days. We can claim that and hear Jesus say, do not be afraid. Secondly, God has always and will always call us to be in relationship, to be relational, to know our essential connection to God and to one another. Jesus' relationship to Peter, that dialogue that happens between them, is the key to Luke 5. There is space for Jesus to speak. There is place for Peter to listen. There is space for Peter to question, and to be reassured. It is what enables Peter to go and be in relationship with all of the people and all of the seeds and churches and persons of faith and witnesses and martyrs that he will touch. As people of faith, we are equipped to build relationships, to listen and question, to be assured and to love. These graces are ours to put to use for the sake of God's life around us. In the end, confess Peter, it is Christ to whom I belong. It is Christ to whom I follow. Can you hear Christ's voice? Can you sense the call? Amen.